Okay, welcome everybody. It's about 1:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is John Vasquez. I am one of the co-chairs of the ResDev committee that helps put on some of these webinars. Today, we're excited to have some speakers who are presenting about, if you saw in the chat, training transitions from research dependence to independence. As many of you know, we had to cancel the NPA conference in California, which was really sad for us. But one of the things that we were able to do is we reached out to all the presenters who had submitted something to present at the conference. And we were lucky enough to get Hinder, Adriana, and Gary to present what they were going to talk about at the conference here for us online. So we're really excited to have them. Harinder Singh is the program director of the University of California, Irvine's Graduate Professional Success in STEM program. He attained his PhD in cardiovascular biology from Temple University School of Medicine, followed by a postdoc training in neurosciences from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Adriana Bankston is a principal legislative analyst at the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations, where she serves as an advocate for UC with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. Gary McDowell is the CEO and founder of Lightroller LLC, a consultancy providing expertise on early career researchers. Gary has a PhD in oncology from the University of Cambridge, UK, and carried out research as a postdoc at Boston Children's Hospital and then Tufts University before co-founding and serving as the executive director of the nonprofit Future of Research. Like I said, we're excited to have them. They'll describe a little bit more about their background. We're using a new venue, so if you could, please make sure you put your microphone on mute. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll make sure to monitor that and ask your questions at the end of the session. So I will turn it over to our fabulous presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks to you and Amy for working with us on setting this up, and thanks to the National Postdoc Association for letting us present all this to you all. I hope you can see the slides, and hopefully you can hear me also. Hi, I'm Gary McDowell. As John said, I'm with a consultancy, Lightroller, just to serve as a financial conflict of interest disclosure. I work with organizations, consulting with them on issues related to early career researchers. But the work I'm talking about today is with Harinder Singh and Adriana Bankston, with whom I worked at the Future of Research nonprofit. They're both still on the board of directors there. And I had the pleasure of being the executive director there for 3 years. Just as a little bit of background, John introduced, it's a non-profit that represents early career researchers. So a lot of grassroots advocacy work, and the goal is promoting systemic change to the way we do science. And it grew out of a meeting we had in Boston in 2014, really trying to give voice to the systemic issues that early career researchers were facing in a hyper-competitive, particularly in the biomedical research enterprise. So to get onto the work in question, I'm talking about independence. The postdoctoral period, I think, should be a period, a golden time in the development of a researcher's independent goals. Your time as a PhD has taught you how to do research, how to science, but the postdoc is the time really to learn how to lead a research effort, and in particular, to start to think about framing your own long-term research question, to set up your own research group and launch your own career. However, there's a fundamental conflict that exists due to the fact that early career researchers, such as grad students and postdocs, they really represent the primary labor force that is driving forward scientific research, and in particular, the acquisition of data. And the focus on early career researchers generating this data can often take priority over taking the time to train them and focus on training and thinking about how to lead a research group. So in particular, I've put up here a reference to the late Ben Barris's comment piece in Nature in 2017, And this piece really addresses the issue of postdocs not being able to take the research projects that they've worked on as a postdoc with them. And this is obviously a hindrance in trying to set up your own laboratory, is that much of what you've worked on you can't take with you. This often relates to the fact that most postdocs, particularly in biomedicine, NIH-funded postdocs, are staff on someone else's research project grant rather than being on, say, their own fellowship or training position that can protect their own research. And they're often fulfilling aims that often someone else wrote before the postdoc was even hired. So this leads to the issue of them being unable to take their work with them. And Barra stated in the piece, I think it's time for the academic community to start openly discussing the issue of research freedom for postdocs, or lack of it. So that sort of leads to the trickier question of what is independence? What is research independence? And if any of you have had a look at the preprint already, you'll already kind of know the spoiler, that we gravitated towards really thinking more of this about as agency as perhaps a better term to think of this rather than independence. But a reasonably good definition of this exists in the 2005 National Research Council report, Bridges to Independence. And really the sentiment there was to try to stop thinking of independence as someone who's a PI with an R01, and more as someone who enjoys the independence of thought. So a great amount of attention, indeed, is paid to the investigator's independence when we're looking at tenure and we're looking at applying for grants and demonstrating that independence. And we were interested in exploring and thinking about this more. It's interesting thinking, for example, about whether this helps or hinders collaborative efforts if people are having to constantly demonstrate whether they were the person in charge or leading, or what their independent role was. So we were interested in thinking about this more, exploring it more, and in particular, as part of the work that we did at Future of Research, in trying to engage directly with early career researchers and get input. So to do this, I led workshops with early career researchers on this particular topic, talking about research independence, at 4 locations. 2 were public institutions and 2 were private research institutions. And they were the University of Illinois at Chicago, University of Chicago, the University of California, Irvine, and the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan. So we followed a model that we have found to be very popular with early career researchers and that we've used right from the very first meeting. We would give a brief intro into the topic to give context for the problem. And then we would ask the early career researchers, or participants generally, to break out into groups and discuss and list the issues that they face in this space, to come up with a list of the problems that they are facing. Now, that's usually not a problem. People are very happy to come up with a list of problems that they're facing in any situation. And so they would come back together, discuss these as a group with the whole room, and then we'd ask them to break into groups and try to come up with solutions to those problems, which is always a bit harder. It's a format we've used a lot, and honestly, it's really engaging and useful because it gives people a bit of a chance to vent, which is always, I think, helpful for early career researchers. But also people tend to leave feeling a bit more positive about the situation because we've finished thinking of, are there ways that we can fix this? And in particular, on whether there are individual actions that people can think about or take away from the room and go and do straight away. So we had about 20 to 50 participants at each of the workshops. And overall, there was a pretty even distribution between graduate students and postdocs. One at University of Chicago was extremely postdoc heavy. There were others that were particularly grad student heavy. Using the input from these workshops, we're then able to group the barriers and the solutions that the early career researchers identified, and we gathered them into 6 groups that we discuss in the preprint, which I believe someone will share in the chat now. And just for ease, so you don't have to read the entire preprint now, we have the tables as a handout, which I think someone is also sharing in the chat now. 3 tables of the barriers, the solutions, and recommendations that we'll discuss at the end. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Dr. Harinder Singh, who will talk about the various groupings of results and solutions that participants came up with.
Thank you, Gary. So all of you have in chat box the table of results. I'm going to talk about the snippets from those results. You don't have to go through all that, but you're free to look at it. So as Gary said, like during these workshops, a lot of responses were collected, and there was a lot of data, and we wanted to categorize into more comprehensive, more understandable format. So we came up with 6 major categories. However, all the responses could not be categorized under these categories, but they are somehow related to these major categories. I'll go through each of the responses, the categories, and talk about some of the barriers early career researchers said that they face in being independent and thinking independently in research, and also some of the solutions ECRs propose, which could be adopted by institute and at ECR level, institute departments, or at grant funding agency levels. Gary, thank you for moving slides. I appreciate that. So the first one was the main one, as Gary said. The definition of independence is once you get the R1 and you're able to think independently. Ideally, the model is that once you do your PhD, you become a postdoc, and you're supposed to be independent, thinking about your project on your own. And PI is the one who will help you in that, help you nurture that thing. However, the way things have evolved from how things used to be in the past due to funding crunch right now and hyper competition, a lot of postdocs and numbers, there is more focus towards publish or perish kind of a model where they have to just keep cranking data and publish data. And that mostly comes from on the labor part gets onto the postdocs and grad students. However, the more creative thinking part gets onto the faculties who just collect data, write grants, and write papers, and postdocs just a lot of times end up being just doing the labor. And that's a model, a lot of responses we actually got, and they shared the same idea. They mentioned that PIs are not ready to involve them into grant writing or project planning because they think this is their job, and they'll come up with a great idea, and they come up with ideas which are more relevant to which might get funded. The postdocs also mentioned that there was no help with project or intellectual freedom. And most of the times they just kept working as tech without guidance or much of an intellectual stimulation. You'll see that in next points, this sort of ties into the same independence model, and the whole idea of independence is discouraged. Some of the solutions which people gave as a result in response to these barriers was, if there is a way to incentivize the whole independence thing so that the PIs also, or the granting agencies, see that if they encourage postdocs and ECRs to become independent, that might help faculties to give projects and give independence of thinking and freedom of ideas to ECRs. The postdocs also said that, as Gary mentioned earlier, postdocs should be allowed to take their grants with them. This is one thing which kept coming up again and again, where they don't have freedom of coming up with ideas, or if they have come with an idea, they're not able to take it to them with them to be able to write grant or move to a different institution. Next slide, please, Gary. This is an interesting one, and this is what since I do right now. I've been working at UC Irvine's Graduate Professional Success in STEM program, which was early funded by NIH BEST. There is really, if you look at the data, 90%, almost 90% of the PhDs, they do not end up in academia. They do not become faculties. Tenure-track faculty positions are only 10%. They've almost stayed constant for a very long time. However, the number of PhDs which are coming out has increased drastically. So that has led to this problem of the glut of postdocs. And also earlier, the data has shown that almost around 80% of the PhDs default into postdoc positions, primarily either due to not knowing what exists out there in terms of career professional development or what jobs they can get into. And other reasons is there are factors in terms of international scholars who do not have the freedom, or there are restrictions on visa to be able to get into other industry positions. So this is something which came up again and again, and ECR shared that there is no training or not enough training, and it's very institute specific on non-academic jobs, and therefore they feel less secure about jobs outside of academia. Even academia itself is very unstable many times. ECR said that I do not want to continue in research and career, but I'm still interested in pursuing careers in teaching and science communication. However, my advisor is unable to help me find those avenues to train for that career, which is, again, a problem all throughout. The other thing also people shared that my PI has a very tunnel vision, and they do not let me think, or they do not let me go out and explore other ways, careers I can get interested or get training on. So that has really resulted in people spending a longer times in their postdoc positions. And that has caused hyper-competition, which I discussed earlier. Some of the solutions which people propose, and these are pretty much in line with what a lot of other institutes who are way ahead of the game are doing, is they said there should be a mandatory career development and networking resources, mentoring for these postdocs and students so that they can think about their careers independently. Industry appreciates a lot of skills like communication skills, entrepreneurship, business acumen, which are not encouraged in this. So if this could be formalized into curriculum, that's something which people ask for. Next slide, please, Gary. Again, this is something which we have heard a lot, and a lot of reports have come out in terms of art of effective mentoring by NASM. Responses by ECS were like they do not have proper training structures. Mentors are not have not been mentored, and they have to figure things out on their own. And it's almost like an experiment which goes on where, as the longer they spend, the more people they mentor, they become better mentors. But I think this model is, we believe, is a very dangerous model where a lot of people lose interest in being academics or even pursuing science later on as a future career. A lot of ECRs end up doing mentoring students and postdocs within the lab, and there is no specific training for that, and they ask for that training. And there is this idea of like either faculty tend to be micromanagers where there's very hands-on approach. Otherwise there's a lot of hands-off approach, and people appreciate that. However, we believe that both the models are not very good mentorship models where you do not get training. And another thing, well, moving over to the solutions, important part about difference between advisor and mentor. A lot of people do not know that, advisor is not a mentor and mentor can be advisor also. So that's the part which people did not understand, and we noticed that during these workshops. Some of the solutions people proposed were there should be mandatory training for mentors. Mentors should be mentored. And they should be mentoring grants, which should require like a mentoring plan in the grant, so that process gets incentivized. Along with evaluating PIs, they should on productivity. They should also be evaluated on what kind of mentoring skills they impart to trainees. Next slide, please, Gary. This was another interesting one, and all three of us are immigrants, Gary, Adriana, and me, and we have been on different kind of visas in the past. And I put executive orders in red here because we really, really cannot ignore what's going on right now, and this has really put a lot of anxiety amongst ECRs, given the fact that more than 50% of the ECRs are of international foreign-born and are on some kind of visa. This also puts a lot of restriction where they feel scared that the PIs, if they do not follow what PI is asking them to do, they might lose their job and they might lose the visa status. There are also restrictions on grant eligibility. There are Fs which international scholars cannot write. And again, there's a bias against immigrant researchers due to the fact that they are not given proper salaries, and that can also result in people not being happy, not feeling independent in research. The salaries and benefits, again, varies from visa to visa, country to country, and then your citizenship status. And that has really added a lot of anxiety amongst ECRs. And this is something we need to do better. A lot of ECRs said that they feel stuck in the academic system. They are very well trained to get into industry, but then they cannot even get into industry setting because they don't have the proper visa. And then some of the solutions which people propose, which we totally agree with, because if NIH is able to make K-99s open for people of international origin to write, why is it that F-series grants are not available for PhDs and international scholars? It is possible. We believe there's maybe lack of motivation, and we'll talk about that later. So PI should also not be allowed to exploit ECR. This exploitation is very rampant all across institutions where they feel just because of that visa status they do that, and that should not be allowed. Departments and institutes have very clear, transparent policies on who is, how the visas are sponsored, how they are filed, when early termination stuff. And one thing which really kept coming up is that peer-to-peer networking groups, they can inform each other about how different policies, how the immigration landscape is changing, and they need to keep track of that. So if Adriana can put that link in the chat box. UC Irvine is today doing a workshop on immigration with Brendan Delaney. He's part of National Postdoc Association also. If you have time, please join. He's going to be talking about different visas and how the current landscape is changing and how the executive orders might affect you. Next slide, please, Gary. Inadequate salaries and benefit. We've collected data and actually looked at how the salaries vary wildly across different institutions. Again, one of the bigger problems is administrators are even, it's difficult for them to identify postdocs and therefore categorize them into what sort of salaries and benefits they fall under. There are 37 different titles for postdocs, and that makes it very, very difficult to have a uniform salary and benefit thing. And the salaries at many places are not commensurate with the cost of living. California is very different, and in the other places where the cost of living is low, there also it's very different. And this also again varies in kind of institution you are in. California is mostly unionized for postdocs, whereas other places it is not. So they suffer through that, and that should not be the case. Some of the solution people said, again, peer-to-peer thing, which kept coming up in all the workshops. There's PhDstipends.com, which people should look and see what stipends PhD students are paid in different institutes. Postdoc salaries data was also collected, and ECR should make informed decision before going into an institution for a postdoc to see what kind of benefits and salaries they are offered if they follow the NIH scale salaries. The increase in salary and benefits should be that of full-time employees, although one of the reason is that they are considered trainees, and therefore they are not full employees. Therefore, sometimes they are not given full benefits. Also, the fact that when you get your own funding, depending on what kind of funding you've gotten, you may lose your full benefits, and because you're not considered a full-time employee. So they should be considered as a job, because postdocs tend to spend a longer times in their postdoc positions, and it should not just be a training. First of all, they're trainees, but they're not given training, and then they should, if they are considered trainees, then a lot of institutes end up, use that excuse to not pay them enough. The next slide, please, Gary. There's a misalignment between academic system, what the academic system wants, and what you personally want. There's been enough data, and we cannot deny that there's a mental health crisis in academia, PhD students and postdocs. The depression rates are similar to that of any other fields like post-traumatic stress disorder amongst in military. And that is resulting in ECRs not feeling independent and being really burdened by the whole idea of too much of workload. They have bad work-life balance. There's imposter syndrome, which is very common. This came up during UC Irvine workshop. Other workshop it came up, but then there was not a proper term people could come up with. They have to sacrifice a lot to become an independent researcher, especially with people who have kids and then lower salaries. Their values, relationships, times, and holidays, that get sacrificed. The solutions which, again, ECRs proposed was that institutes should ensure that there is work-life balance. There should be more avenues for ECRs to go and seek counseling and help. And there should be very clear-cut laid out expectations from ECRs, and they should be communicated with the PIs. And again, do not be afraid to go and change the lab culture, because this is in your best interest. And you are going to be in that lab for some time, and you want to make sure that you work in a more conducive and healthy work environment. Peer-to-peer, again, this is something some people, people talk within the group, but then there are some ECRs who have really taken things in their own hands, and they're raising voices and telling them, bringing more awareness about this issue. PhD balance, which was PhD depression outcome earlier started by Susanna Harris, something which I highly recommend people to look into. This is something which people propose. Dragonflymentalhealth.com is another one where you can keep track of, how the academia is suffering through different mental health and how you can cope up with those things. So with all these things, this is the actual data and results we collected. We have our own recommendation, but then what from other academies has come out is in line with what we propose, we discuss in the paper. I'll give it to Adriana now for the recommendation part. Adriana?
Thank you, Harinder. So you just heard about the recommendations that were made from the workshop participants in all these 6 categories. So I'd like to now put this in a bit of a broader context in terms of what different stakeholders can do to address the issue of independence for early career researchers, as well as trying to fit that into the larger recommendations from the national academies in the reports that we looked at, starting with the Bridges to Independence in 2005, all the way up to mentorship in 2019. And thinking about how these are framed within what we talked about in the workshops and also recommendations from the reports as well. So particularly looking at these 6 themes, if you look at table 4 that was shared, you'll see recommendations by specific stakeholders. I didn't put all of the bullet points in here, but just to summarize a few of the major ones here, they revolve around recommendations for ECRs themselves, which are essentially thinking about PI setting clear expectations and ECRs being able to do their own research on the lab before they join, to really make sure that they know what the expectations are when they join the lab, as well as knowing the expectations in terms of publications, working hours, and the types of salaries and benefits that will be provided to them, as well as whether that particular PI encourages independence overall. So these really touch upon a lot of the areas that were discussed today. And so this quote that I'm showing here is from the mentorship report, but really encompasses a lot of these things, specifically in terms of evaluating and looking at the mentorship that happens in labs, and just thinking more broadly about, again, expectations, also accountability and reviews of how mentorship occurs, because obviously mentorship really feeds into a lot of the other aspects that were discussed here in terms of having a good mentor that will really foster all those things versus someone who might not. And this is a really fundamental concept to start from. So in the next slide, we'll talk about recommendations from participants, again, for PIs and research groups. So you can see there's a lot more here, trying to encompass both of these things into one slide. A few of the recommendations also from different reports here. So one of the really prevalent recommendations that came out of this is train the trainer. So how do we mentor mentors to really be that instead of just being advisors or supervisors, thinking about the difference between mentors and supervisors in this context, and providing training for them to provide to their ECRs as well. The second quote is really thinking about professional development. So again, this comes up again and again, as Harinder mentioned, in terms of incorporating professional development into the curriculum that's offered to graduate students, regardless whether or not they stay in academia. There's a lot of things that they need to learn, and this has been proposed several times in the workshops and also aligns with the report recommendations. The next is, again, what Harinder mentioned around budgetary safety nets. And so really making sure that we are paying our postdocs enough to really be able to stay in science and do their research. So this is really one of the large barriers, right, that a lot of people have in terms of salaries, not only being variable, but being very low compared to cost of living, and drives a lot of really good talent out of science because of that. So this is another really important point to consider, is whether there may be some safety nets in terms of being able to keep postdocs in science. And the last one, so I did mention the visa issues, so there are also recommendations on that without going into a whole lot of details. and the mental health, which is really critical as well in terms of, again, thinking about how you can establish really supportive environments, healthy work habits, as well as one of the recommendations being that there should be climate surveys performed in institutions to really assess how this is helping ECRs evolve in their career. So this is a lot of our recommendations that were proposed by ECRs in the workshops align with these. And it's interesting to see that these have been proposed over several years and also in several reports. So we endorse these as well. And so I've talked to you about so far ECRs and institutional recommendations. So the last stakeholder is funding agencies, which really plays a major role in developing independence for ECRs at multiple levels. In terms of the recommendations that were made, again, making sure that they have their own independent funding, they're able to take their projects with them when they leave. Again, having programming for career development also obviously will come from research agencies that are able to fund these programs, as well as mentoring plans and career advancement in terms of accountability for PIs. And so all of these are coming up again in this section in terms of funding agencies really feeding into all of these areas that were discussed earlier. And so and it's also, again, interesting that this was mentioned in the independence report in terms of resources being provided to postdocs in terms of career development and funding are really critical for independence, as well as including teaching and mentoring, which again was mentioned as a really critical aspect of this transition. So overall, these recommendations really indicate that each stakeholder has an important role in fostering the independence of early career researchers in academia and also other careers. And thinking about how we can encourage each of these groups to play a role in fostering independence for ECRs. So that's overall the sort of broader context of this, and I'll turn it back to Gary to hear about what you have to say and your questions. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Adriana, and thanks, Hinder, too. Yeah, we've put this all down. There's a lot that we went through here, but we put it all down into preprint that was sent along in the chat there. We're really, we made it a preprint because this is very much like an introductory sort of way of thinking for us, and to try and promote a discussion about the larger issue of independence. I think it's really been interesting for us to think about what is the role of training versus labor. The labor needs to be done, but also the training needs to happen. And, it's been really interesting trying to dig into that. So we're really curious to hear from you, any reactions or thoughts to these things. Is there anything obvious that ECRs didn't mention? And in particular, with this audience, are there things that sort of institutions or PDOs can be doing, or examples of things that are already addressing these issues that that could be mentioned and could be widely disseminated and promoted? So we'd really like to hear from you. I'll take any questions, I guess.
I think there was one question. Can your postdoc mentor be different from the PI you're working for? While Kay was able to answer, depends on funding, but I and NIH have recommended that postdocs have at least 2 mentors. What do you think about that, Gary?
Yeah, it's one I find particularly interesting coming from the UK to the US, and maybe you both have thoughts on this too. The term mentor is used here pretty much automatically, whereas in the UK we tend to talk about supervisors or advisors. And I think it's really interesting that mentorship has become so tied with the person who you work for. I think sort of if you look in sort of the business world, it's not that can be the case, but I think there are issues that are brought up by the person mentoring you also having a contractual relationship with you. It can cause some pitfalls. So I think there's a lot of good recommendations, particularly in the mentoring report, I think, addressing there's also formal mentors versus informal. So for example, I can think of a K99 award. People have been putting down sort of co-mentors on there. Sometimes tying a junior person with a more senior person. That could be interesting and for collaborations. But then also sort of informal mentorship networks too, I think are very important, within the academy, within your department, within, and also with people outside the academy. Well, one piece of advice that I sort of caution against actually is there's this advice that goes around of, if you're not getting good mentorship from your PI, you should find someone else in the department who is a good mentor and go to them for your mentorship. And the issue there is that if there's one person in the department that everyone is going to for mentorship and they're not getting any recognition or reward for it, you actually can possibly hinder their work while in a way giving the people who aren't mentoring a competitive advantage. And I think it's important to try and think of recognition for mentorship as well as just providing it and providing those structures.
If I can add, the NPA has a terrific site that has multiple guides on mentoring, mastering the art of mentoring, how to be proactive in your mentoring. If you need more resources, I dropped a link in the chat.
Great.
May I chime in?
If I may, go ahead,
Joseph.
I just wanted to react to this. Another aspect I wanted to bring up is when you have a primary mentor here, you're also discouraged from looking for other mentors sometimes, and depending on the culture of the lab. And some people may not feel comfortable seeking out another mentor who may be better, like a surrogate mentor or something like that. So just wanted to point that out.
Mm-hmm.
There's one, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
I was thinking about the professional development opportunities you guys mentioned. So I'm a postdoc, but I work with our university postdoc association to try to provide these professional development opportunities. And we basically have to pull teeth to get postdocs to attend. So I know it's really easy to sit in a workshop and complain that you don't have professional development opportunities, but it seems harder to go to them when you have them. So what do we do about that? Is there a way we can sort of make the value, besides you're helping your career, but is there some way that we can make these more valuable to encourage people to attend? And did that come up in any of your workshops, and have you guys thought about that?
That's interesting. I was in another conversation about this kind of thing this morning and was reflecting on, the input that we have in the preprint is obviously limited by the fact of the people who were there, and we didn't hear from the people who weren't there. And I think there's two different populations broadly to think about there. There's the people who you can't help to help, honestly. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I think as long as the opportunities are there, I mean, that is one part of it. But there is definitely an issue, and I think a lot of us who do workshops know this phenomenon. If you ask at the start of your workshop, hands up if you told your PI that you're here. Usually not many people put their hands up. And certainly, again, thinking about this from an immigrant perspective and being on a visa, and particularly talking to some, we had quite a lot of foreign representation in the workshops, but also I've spoken to a lot of foreign folks who don't feel comfortable going to these things. And there are people who really have their time extremely closely scrutinized by the PI, and it can tie in with the, the visa hanging over them as well. So I think there's a population that's maybe not so much worth worrying about, but then there's a population that we really should be concerned about, which is, do people feel like they can actually partake in these things? And I think there's probably people who have done online things or a movement to move things online that, is a little bit incentivized by the fact that you can be in lab, but also be in training. And, this is all pointing to quite a disappointing culture in I have to pretend or not tell people that I'm doing this thing. And it's not always because of the PI explicitly saying. A lot of PIs, are perfectly happy, but there's a lack of communication. There's multiple issues there, I think, to try to address. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I tend to focus on the first population, but you're right that maybe the second population are the people we should be focusing on. And maybe there are department level things we can do, like encouraging PIs to report the number of professional development hours their postdocs attend or something. And but yeah, that's a really good thought. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that too, just that in the UK, your institution and also your funding agency basically mandates that you have a certain number of days of professional development training a year, and your department head has to sign off on it. You know, I had to go do training, and the bar is very low. It's like if you go to the weekly seminar, you can check that off as a half afternoon, because, you know, you have to give an outlet for people who aren't interested in doing the training. But for those who really want to get professional development training, it gives them that mandate to go out and do it. So that to me is I think that's relatively common in Europe. So I think it's a particularly sometimes American thing of that hours in lab equals productivity kind of mentality, which applies across American work culture generally, I think.
So if I can add something to it first, like it's really important, like as Gary mentioned, the faculty buy-in. But in terms of actual actionable things, which you can do if the faculty buy-in is not that enough and the departments and schools are not taking much of an initiative. One of the things which our program and other programs have done is you give them incentives for attending career and professional development events. And how do you do that? Maybe you can keep track of people who are attending your events and just sort of like, we provide them like professional development credits. And based on the number of credits they have taken, we let them take these Division of Continuing Education courses on professional development, which usually cost around $700 to $900. And this was something which across campus collaboration. And that has really helped us increase the participation by postdocs and grad students in these events, because they have something, they want to take this course, and they can take this course for $900,000 only if they attend 4 or 5 events. So that model has really, really worked very well for us. Again, sometimes there are restrictions on how many people can attend a particular course or class or an event. You can actually use that also as a sort of a eligibility, that if you attended these many events or credits, then only you can come and attend this thing. So I would highly recommend that if you can start that thing from your own, at your own level only. It has worked.
Thank you.
So there's a question, I think maybe Adriana, you could answer this, Bert. How do any of these recommendations have any teeth in face of vested interests? I appreciate that recommendations for funding agencies is a good step, but universities and PIs don't feel compelled to follow something that is only recommended, especially if they can continue the status quo with no accountability.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So it's interesting. So in my role at UC, I'm kind of at sort of the nexus of a lot of different sectors between researchers and really thinking about how they advocate to policymakers for what they do. We are sort of also the sort of federal face of UC, and being able to let them know what's happening when new grant opportunities are coming out and things like that. I think, so in that sense, I think thinking about how to facilitate more of these conversations between researchers and funding agencies would be beneficial. So for example, a lot of researchers don't know that they can contact their program managers and talk about how to improve their grants, that is a resource. And so a lot of the things that we do in this office is trying to facilitate that connection and making sure that funding agencies are aware of what they're doing, but also being really a partner in that advocacy for the research that's going on. So I think it's a difficult question, but one of the, this is, I guess, to put a plug for this, one of the things to do is engage your university representatives who are sort of in this middle space that can facilitate that conversation.
Thank you. And I think there's an interesting question by Kay Marie. What are your thoughts on argument that if postdocs are considered employees instead of trainees, that they will not be allowed to pursue career development activities? I can say that, and I would like to hear what Gary and Adriana has to say. So in our program, since we run program with not a lot of buy-in from faculties and schools and departments sometimes, we do not stop anyone from attending events, especially when these online format, anyone can pretty much attend events. I know there are like some career departments which they have restrictions, but it all depends on how good or how well you're tracking. And I feel it's still possible. It's just like if people really want to do it. Gary, Adriana, do you have any thoughts?
I think, as you know, I think academia is relatively unique in professions in thinking that professional development only happens when you're training. I think that mentality leads to the attitude that I am a PI and therefore do not need training, or I'm a PI and cannot get access to training, or we do not need to provide access to training for faculty. When I was at Future of Research, the most common thing that new faculty contacted me about was, how do I get access to training on mentorship? How do I find resources on mentorship? And you know, it was, I think a lot of faculty are thrown in, new faculty are thrown into these positions of having to do an entirely new job compared to what they were doing recently. And then are provided little to no support because, of course, they've been in training for a decade. So I think there's a larger issue of like the staff versus trainee. You know, I think staff scientists should be getting professional development. I think at every level, people should be getting professional development. And, you know, you even see this in training around issues such as sexual harassment, that, you know, it's not just the grads and postdocs who get this kind of thing. So I think there's a cultural issue there of thinking, now that I don't think it's fair to say now that I have a lab, I don't need training. I think there is a cultural mentality that once one has a lab, one does not need training. I think a lot of faculty are actually, certainly with mentorship, which is why we're careful in our language in mentorship. It's not faculty should be trained in how to mentor, although a lot of people approach it from that direction. Grad students mentor undergrads, postdocs mentor grad students. You know, people are mentoring all through the system. A lot of senior people have said to me, I would really appreciate mentorship now as a like mid or late career PI. And it, you know, I think behooves us to think about like actual proper professional development training, especially in managing and mentoring people, which is essentially what faculty and beyond are doing as a major role. And starting that right when people start to have students that they are, you know, that they are looking after and are training.
That's actually a good point. In my program, I've seen a lot of like young faculties who are just starting. They come and attend a lot of our events which are relevant to them. And I mean, if I could just say that a lot of old faculty just do not show up. And in fact, they would prevent other people from coming. Adriana, unless you have something to add, I can go to the next question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think to kind of piggyback on Gary's point, I think there's a lot of, obviously, postdocs, there's a lot of, I guess, controversy about what it should be defined as. And because obviously it is a position, obviously we argue and have argued for the last few years at Future of Research that it should be a training position in terms of a lot of different things that need to be incorporated. And actually that came up in the workshops too, that a lot of these offerings only exist for grad students, and something similar needs to be implemented for postdocs as well. And so I could see that as being something moving forward. And just thinking about, you know, the whole continuum, right? So what Gary was mentioning, you're training future generations, but also thinking about the things that you need to develop as you become faculty, and a lot of things that go into that, like managing budgets and teams and other things that you know, need to be really incorporated into this position. So I think there's a lot of, I guess, a lot to be said in reforming the postdoc position as well as part of that.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question, very interesting question from Madeline Hauser. Have you all given much thought on how training and independence needs might look different for ECRs who do not want to run their own research program, but want to pursue more of a staff scientist or research associate track? That's why I said interesting question. For instance, there might also be parallels in industry, government, etc. The key funding mechanism that postdocs are expected to apply for instance, are not directed to ECRs interested in those sort of tracks. I'll share something, but Gary or Adriana, you go ahead first.
That's a great question. I will say we have not thought about it enough, perhaps. So we're definitely open to like discussing that more and thinking about it. I will say one of the interesting things I've had in some of the discussions I've had with top leadership at NIH have been this argument that it is not the job of the NIH to train people. And I think this comes under the sort of the mission, the mandate, that the job of the NIH is to to carry out research, and its principal mission is not training. And so this then becomes, this sort of creates the part of the dichotomy between training versus staffing of grants. I think NIGMS is doing a lot of work trying to shift things in this direction, particularly with T32s. But it's definitely a really good point that fellowships and I think there were a couple of things, I'm trying to remember exactly. There might be a couple of mechanisms, I'm not exactly sure, that sort of addressed from the SBIR side of things. I'm not sure if there's anything particularly focused on training. I know that in the National Academies report I was on, we tried to talk about training kind of mechanisms that would shift people towards entrepreneurship as like one example of things that could go there. But it's a really great question. I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, so just to add to that, so UC actually used to have a program for transitioning into entrepreneurship at some point. I think, this is something that I think the system needs to incorporate and think about in the future in terms of adding more of these funding opportunities. And even for staff scientists, I think this also depends on what their career trajectory is, because that's could be only part of their career and where they want to go. And again, the skills they need to gain while they're doing research in the lab applies to this group as well in terms of developing these things. To go into business and government, there's a lot of these skills that go into that as well. So it still goes back to training.
If I can just jump in quickly, one way of flipping this on its head and thinking about it is because foreigners are excluded from training mechanisms, but a lot of foreigners stay as faculty, there's actually this interesting other problem that a lot of the faculty who stay in the US aren't possibly trained. So we're sort of training a lot of our faculty without training them in that sense too. So those are, I think, two sides of the same coin. Yeah.
I also wanted to add a comment here. I fully support this idea that we should really bolster staff scientists at institutions and if universities. Sorry, and you can see this actually at National Institutes of Health itself has a lot of staff scientists. So it's much more common in our national labs and National Institutes of Health. I foresee an issue with that though in the as we continue, because if we're talking about R01s, they're not structured to allow for that kind of budget. So there's an economical argument here that makes it very difficult to bolster this. And so I think that's why universities are very reluctant to start talking about, okay, let's create a staff scientist position, and we're going to have echelons for it, like staff scientist 1, 2, 3, and we're going to have benefits that go with it. We're going to build careers around this, but it's all funded from R01 money. That doesn't work. So then the onus falls onto the university to come up with the money. And that's an issue in and of itself, because their funding models are also very different. And this is something I tried to work on when I was at University of Illinois at Chicago, and it was just very, very difficult conversations, because we're talking, focusing back on the labor conversation. It's like, what is the labor of research and who is doing it?
Right.
It's just much cheaper to have students and postdocs do it, and that's the end all be all of it, unfortunately, at this stage.
I'm extremely tired of having the staff scientist conversation in all of the different forums I've had it in, because everyone agrees it's a good idea and nobody is willing to pay for it. And that it'll never happen. And especially when the postdoc exists, if you have a postdoc and a staff scientist and you can get away with the postdoc doing the same work as a staff scientist would do, why on earth would you pay more for a staff scientist? I think the rationale behind a postdoc being cheaper is that you're supposed to get less work out of them because they're training. And that is really not the case. And so I've heard arguments, institutions can't afford to pay for staff scientists, but then also I've heard arguments that for NIH grants to be paying for staff scientists is quote, white coat welfare, and paying stable jobs from federal tax dollars is not the business of the government. interesting argument. But I don't think there's ever going to be any way to reconcile it, and particularly when the postdoc can be utilized in the way it is. Just quickly noticing the time, again, very happy to take comments on this, and please email us with your thoughts. Like, really, this has been really interesting. The preprint is there exactly for having these discussions and to get, to see if we can prompt more thought and more discussion about it. Yeah.
Maybe we can, in interest of time, if we can take one last question by Catherine, and I think this is more relevant to COVID-19 crisis, which is really good. So given the issues with work-life balance that came up in the workshops and the way COVID-19 has blurred these lines and boundaries even more, what recommendations do you have for postdocs ECRs during this time?
So I can start with what we've been doing. So and also personally engaging in a lot of professional development. So I think the thing to consider is it's obviously thinking about how research is halted and how that will affect the pipeline and generally, but also I would say use this time to work on your professional development, because there's a lot of things you can do online through this and different events. And obviously virtual learning has allowed for really more accessibility as well. So, it's been interesting to see even in our events, people from all over the world interacting through Zoom, and that's, there's a lot of opportunities to work on that while you're at home.
Yeah, I totally agree with Adrienne on that. We've had like a lot of participation from people who were sitting at home, who were asked to write grants and papers. This is a great time, you have data, but then everyone eats lunch, and 12 to 1 is lunchtime, and people actually log in and dial in and listen to our things. And also the other thing is, like, even if some people are going back to lab, again, that's something, a totally different discussion, why they're going to lab if the university has said you shouldn't be in lab or the lab should be shut down. But people who are there, they're also, again, just tuning in via phone and just listening to things, almost like having a radio NPR in the background. I think from my experience, from my program, professional development, I feel like this is a silver lining which has been exposed by COVID-19, and I'm really trying to make best use of it. So I would highly encourage that and have a lot of online programming. I think, so there are a lot of questions we couldn't answer, but we have taken those questions and we'll try to get back to you. We have saved the questions, but all of us would like to sincerely thank NPA for giving us a chance to do this workshop, even when the NPA meeting could not happen, and appreciate all the questions and comments by all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
No, thank you all for joining us. And I think you're also all, I know Adriana is on LinkedIn. I think all of you are on LinkedIn as well, right? So we can move conversations there. Thank you all for joining us as well for this month's webinar. Next month, August 5th, coincidentally enough, we'll be having the National Organization of Research Development Professionals present to talk about different pathways after the PhD and after the postdoc. And so they'll be talking about one non-traditionally, as they describe it, one non-traditionally traveled pathway or career. And so I hope you'll join us then, and we'll continue this conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you all next month.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I have saved these chats. John, is there a way to get chat history, or if it's not possible,
I have no idea. That's a good question for Amy.
Okay. Don't worry about it. I have it saved, and we will try to see, maybe just have a conversation around it.
Yeah.
Gary, do you know
It says messages are also recorded.
Oh, great.
I just opened it up, but I'm not sure what that means. So glad you have a backup.
Yeah, I just copied from the chat just so we have the
Perfect.
text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
If you think it would be helpful, we can go back to these questions if they want answers to send to the participants.
Yeah, and I think it might be helpful if you wanted to just, like if you're on Twitter, just continue the conversation on Twitter.
Yeah.
And tag us or at us, and you can keep it going. We're trying to do a much better job not just us, but leadership, and like making sure we're engaging folks more on social media, especially for us. So this will give us an opportunity to like push that out and get them to do that more, or get us to do that more.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Amina agrees, and I'm
All right. So yeah, thank you. And if anybody wants to join the Brendan Delancey Immigration Workshop, all of you who are immigrants, I mean, this is close to my heart. And I mean, I just like barely by inches survived, because only 2 months ago I got my permanent residency. Otherwise, I would be in the same boat, and I feel about that. And thank you, Joseph, for giving me that idea. We were able to get Brendan for this workshop here at UC Irvine.
We had a workshop 2 days before the executive order. The timing was horrible, and it's I might actually send out an invitation to your workshop saying, hey, this is Brandon again, and now that the executive order has come into play, and so maybe he can speak to that. And
yeah, absolutely.
If you'll accept my Kentucky postdocs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is open to anyone and everyone. You know, I used to have only like basic 100 member joining kind of Zoom account. I increased to 500, so I don't care. Okay. Nobody's asking me for just for data now. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention about the question about teeth. I think that a lot of institutions are actually talking about making mentoring part of the PNT, and I think that they're being serious about it.
That would be great.
And interestingly enough, at my institution, it's come from the graduate students' well-being angle. So this is, I'm part of a work group that's currently trying to build recommendations for the provost. That's not to say that he's going to agree to them. But one of the recommendations that we're going to do is, part of the PNT process is to provide evidences of teaching and evidence of research, and we're just going to ask for evidences of mentorship. And it doesn't have to be complicated. I mean, evidences of teaching and research are kind of open-ended questions, and it really, departments can build their own systems, and I think that that's something that to me seems very promising. That idea, although we've all had this idea. The idea actually came from the VPR of our institution. She was like, "Why don't we just do this? This is simple, like, what, And I was like, "Okay, yes, let's get behind it." So
that sounds great.
I think that that's going to build up, and I think that faculty who primarily do research are very interested in this because they always worry about their teaching. And so they don't have like a good teaching evidences, and so being able to supply mentoring evidences kind of would balance that a little bit. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm working with a group who were trying to come up with like things that could actually demonstrate that to like work with people. So it's interesting to know there might be a market for that rather than just us hoping there would be. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough question because I mean it ultimately comes down to culture change, and a lot of this is how do you convince people to do something. I mean, this is a lot of what we advocate for, right? So, and I mean, from my perspective, I'm just kind of in the middle point of trying to bridge the gap between the two in my role, but it's really, again, presenting the information, here's what you can do, and they do it or they don't, right? But in terms of mentoring, so I wanted to mention that our mentoring paper just got published, and it does have some examples of institutions that already adopted some of the guidelines that we have. So we can share that with the MPA also.
Even with this professional development part for this work, I mean, Boston University is doing it, UMass is doing it. I think in Canada, some places are doing it. They have actually incorporated career professional development in their core curriculum. They do a small portion as they come in, almost taking all the classes first year. And then as you, after post candidacy time, you do that. I mean, if those institutes are able to do it, and it seems you just have to get people from within or your alumni engage them. So
yeah, I mean, the grad students are demanding it as well.
Yeah.
This has happened, I think, for the last maybe now 5 years, is that, Michigan was really on top of this. They're like, oh yeah, people are demanding this stuff, so we have to do it. That's why they published all of their outcomes data, before anyone asked. They're like, attracting people here, and we're in the Midwest, and so we have more trouble attracting people here, sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's great. Hopefully that'll trickle.
Yeah, Cynthia Furman's stuff, like she's the one who really took a lead on this, and there are a lot of stuff she's written, her experiences and how you can build it and data collected. That's something which I would highly recommend reading her stuff.
Right, I'm gonna jump off.
All right, okay, thank
Yeah.
you. It was nice seeing all of you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks again for having us. Bye-bye.